Hi, my name is Sam, a spray product engineer at Spraying Systems Company. Today, I'm going to demonstrate the disassembly and assembly of the new TankJet 50 to show how to service the unit when necessary. To begin, we're going to need a vise, preferably with soft jaws, a couple of adjustable wrenches, a torque wrench, a 3/8 drive socket wrench, a 1/4 socket, an 11/16 socket, a 5/64 Allen wrench, 3/4, 1, and 1 13/16 crowfoot sockets, needle nose pliers, a flathead screwdriver, a pick tool, FDA grade lubricant, Loctite 242 or 243, and a spare parts kit. We begin by inserting the TankJet 50 in soft vise jaws on the flats of the transition housing, being sure that it's held tightly and securely. First, remove the inlet cap and O-ring. Then, using the needle nose pliers, remove the stator from the main tube body. Then, remove the main tube body from the transition housing, and using the pick tool, remove the O-ring from the inside of the main tube body. Next, insert the flathead screwdriver in the side of the rotor to keep it from spinning. And then, use the 1/4 inch socket to remove the nut from the gearbox input shaft. Once the nut and lock washer are removed, then remove the rotor. Using the 5/64 Allen wrench, remove the 4 low-profile socket head screws inside of the top housing. Once those screws are removed, pull the top housing off of the gearbox. The gearbox filter disc is sandwiched between the top housing and gearbox. This filter needs to be inspected and periodically washed. Next, remove the gearbox using an adjustable wrench while holding the fixed stem with the other adjustable wrench. Once the gearbox is removed, remove the gearbox output pin. This pin may fall out upon removal of the gearbox. Now that the gearbox is removed, use an adjustable wrench to remove the fixed stem. Now, using an 11/16 socket, remove the nozzle hub retainer from the rotary housing. Once this is removed, you can slide the nozzle hub guard and bevel gear nozzle hub off. Once the nozzle hub guard is removed from the bevel gear nozzle hub, inspect the nozzle hub bushings to see if a replacement is necessary. If so, remove the nozzle hub bushings using your fingers or the pick tool. Next, using an adjustable wrench on the flats of the rotary housing to hold it in place, stick the flathead screwdriver through the side inlet of the drive stem to remove it. Once the drive stem is removed, the drive tube, tube bushing, and rotary housing will be able to slide out from the bottom. Now, all that remains is the transition housing, fixed tube, and bevel gear. First, remove the O-ring from the transition housing using the pick tool. Then, using the same tool, remove the thrust bearing bushing, thrust bearing, and lip seal. Clean and inspect the thrust bearing to determine if replacement is necessary. This concludes the disassembly of the TankJet 50. To reassemble the TankJet50 unit, place the transition housing in the soft jaws of the vise, lubricate the O-ring, and stretch it over the transition housing threads until it sits at the bottom of the threads. Then, insert the lip seal with the open side faced upwards in the transition housing. Then, lubricate the thrust bearing with the FDA-grade lubricant. Insert the thrust bearing bushing into the thrust bearing, and insert the two parts with the bushing facing upwards in the transition housing. Then, roll the tube bushing into a ring shape and insert it through the bottom of the bevel gear. Next, hold the drive stem on top of the thrust bearing bushing, applying some pressure while sliding the drive tube and rotary housing through the bevel gear and fixed tube, spinning it clockwise until it engages with the drive stem. Once engaged, remove the drive stem and apply Loctite to the threads on the drive tube threads. And reinsert the drive tube into the drive stem. Once this is tightened by hand, you can hold the drive stem with a flathead screwdriver and use a 3/4 inch crowfoot socket with a torque wrench on the rotary housing to apply about 10 foot-pounds. Now, insert a nozzle hub bushing into the back and front of the bevel gear nozzle hub. Then, attach the nozzle hub guard onto the bevel gear nozzle hub. Next, carefully stick the bevel gear nozzle hub onto the rotary housing until it sits perfectly on the stem. Now, apply some Loctite to the nozzle hub retainer threads and attach the nozzle hub retainer using a torque wrench with an 11/16 socket onto the rotary housing stem. Torque requirement is 10 foot-pounds. Now, apply Loctite to the external threads of the fixed stem and hand thread the fixed stem to the transition housing. Then torque the fixed stem to 10 foot-pounds using the 1-inch crowfoot socket and torque wrench. Now, insert the gearbox output pin into the gearbox. Apply Loctite to the gearbox threads and carefully thread the gearbox into the fixed stem. If the gearbox does not fully thread on, spin the rotary housing while threading the gearbox to ensure engagement between the gearbox and drive stem. Once the gearbox is fully threaded onto the fixed stem, torque it down to 10 foot-pounds using the 1 3/16 crowfoot socket and torque wrench. Now, insert the bearing guide into the center of the top housing through the top. Then insert the filter disc on the bottom of the top housing, snapping it in place to the top housing and bearing guide. Be sure to line up the holes of the filter disc to the holes of the top housing so that the socket head screws can be inserted. Once the filter disc and bearing guide are in, attach the top housing to the gearbox. Then, using the 5/64 Allen wrench, attach the low-profile socket head screws, along with the gasket square rings, by hand into the gearbox through the top housing. Then, tighten the low-profile socket head screws. Next, insert the rotor into the top housing and through the gearbox input shaft. Then, holding the rotor in place using a flathead screwdriver, attach the lock nut and nut on the gearbox input shaft. Then, torque down the nut using the 1/4 socket and torque wrench to 5 foot-pounds. Now, lubricate the O-ring for the main tube body and insert the O-ring into the main tube body to properly seat it in the groove. Then, attach the main body tube onto the transition housing. Be sure that the main body tube O-ring does not get displaced by the top housing during this step. Then, using needle nose pliers, place the stator in the top housing. Next, lubricate and install the O-ring that sits on the inlet cap. Finally, install the inlet cap onto the main tube body and torque it down to 40 foot-pounds using the 1-inch crowfoot socket and torque wrench. This completes the TankJet 50 assembly. To learn more about the TankJet 50 or our entire TankJet product line, visit tankjet.com or call 1-800-95-SPRAY.